Hello and welcome to the No Huddle Dynasty Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host Mark, and I'm looking forward to sharing this episode with you. But first, I'd like to give a shout out to the guys over at the Aussie NFL Fantasy Show. This is the #1 Australian-made fantasy football podcast. The guys are the absolute best in the industry, delivering top-shelf content every week. Make sure to stop by and check out Manchok, giving out his fresh pastries to the previous week's top performers. While you're there, make an appointment with Taylor for Dr. Goodcall to predict some wholesome fantasy starters for the current week. Then take your seat in the gallery while Matty C delivers fantasy justice on some poor fantasy performers in Public Defender, before finally listening to the guys battle it out in starts of the week. You can find them on all social media platforms. YouTube, their handle is youtube.com/@Aussie NFL Fantasy. Twitter, they're @Aussie_fantasy. Instagram, Aussie NFL Fantasy. TikTok @Aussie NFL Fantasy, as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Now, back to the show. On today's show, titled You Shall Remain Nameless, we're running a kind of this or that option. We're going to be doing two different sets of stats at quarterback. So a quarterback 1 and a quarterback 2 option. Followed by fantasy output, and I'll be doing the same for running back. Now, what we're trying to establish today is how much value do we as fantasy owners put in a player's name, and is it necessarily the right way to go? Is there any value to a name? And hopefully by highlighting a couple of different examples within a position group, we can see sort of whether we automatically, when we hear a player's name, we assign it to a certain value when really we probably shouldn't. I'll also do one wide receiver and one tight end. And just as a hypothetical, if this trade came across to you, would you automatically decline it basically because of a name? And I won't list any player names to start with. At the end of the exercise, I'll reveal which player is assigned to which set of stats. So hopefully this is good for you guys, and hopefully you get something out of it. So we'll kick off with quarterback, and I'll list quarterback 1 stats, followed by quarterback 2, and then do a small recap before revealing which player is which. So for quarterback 1, he's played 7 games. He's achieved 2,009 yards passing, 48 yards rushing, 12 touchdowns, 4 intercepts, 10 sacks, 0 rushing touchdowns, and 2 fumbles lost. So total fantasy points this season, thanks to Fantasy Pros, is 125.36 at an average of 17.90. So with the quarterback specifically, I'm not going to do this for running back, but I'll go back historically. So I'll go 2 seasons past, just to try and get a bit of a gauge. So I'll jump back to 2020 first. So 15 games for this player, 4,570 all-purpose yards, 36 combined touchdowns, and 10 intercepts. In 2021, we had 17 games, 5,316 all-purpose yards, 41 combined touchdowns, and 15 intercepts. Now, through the first 7 games this player has played, his fantasy points per week have gone something like this. So week 1, 23.3, week 2, 24.5, week 3, 13.6, week 4, 21.1, week 5, 14.4, week 6, 9.4, and week 7, 18.1. So just to flip back to the historical data that I just flushed out earlier, average fantasy points across the season of 2020 was 22.85, and the average for 2021 was 23.27. So players fairly consistent. This having a slightly down year considering the 17.90 average across 7 games. But if you remember back to a couple of episodes ago, when I did my rolling team of the year, I mentioned that something that I do specifically is I like to set a points range for each position. So I know what to expect each week. So for me, quarterback, I want to know that I've got a quarterback in that starting position that's going to get me anywhere between 15 and say 22 to 25 points a week. Obviously more is great, but if I keep sort of realistic in that range, I can sort of understand whether or not I'm in that matchup. So we'll jump over to quarterback 2. So same amount of games played, so 7 games. This player's got 1,734 passing yards, 40 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, 5 intercepts, 14 sacks, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 1 fumble lost. So total fantasy points for the season so far is 126.36 at an average of 18.05. Historically, jumping back to 2020, 16 games played, 4,421 all-purpose yards, 36 combined touchdowns, and 13 intercepts. In 2021, this player had 16 games again, 4,336 all-purpose yards, 34 combined touchdowns, and 7 intercepts. Fantasy points per week across the first 7 games this player has played is 19.1 in week 1, week 2 is 11.8, week 3, 18.3, week 4 is 13.9, week 5 is 23.2, week 6 is 16.7, and week 7 is 23.5. Your average for 2020 was 19.95 fantasy points, and the average across the 2021 season was 19.20. So nice and consistent from this player. Again, it's hitting for my range, my points range, hits everything I need to. And similar to the first player, fairly consistent. You're not sort of having that great year and then a down year. 3 years in a row, pretty consistent fantasy output. So just to recap, and I'll just do the stats from this year, won't do the historical stuff. So quarterback 1 was 7 games, 2,009 yards passing, 48 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns, 4 intercepts, 10 sacks, no rushing touchdowns, 2 fumbles lost, 125.36 fantasy points total this season at an average of 17.90, compared to quarterback 2, which was 1,734 passing yards, 40 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, 5 intercepts, 14 sacks, 2 rushing touchdowns, 1 fumble lost, 126.36 total fantasy points at an average of 18.05. So players are pretty close in terms of fantasy points. I would say the big difference is pretty much in touchdowns scored. So to reveal, quarterback 1, hopefully in this time you've had your own guess at which players they were, but quarterback 1 is Justin Herbert, and quarterback 2 is Kirk Cousins. So when we're looking at those two players, if you were in a position to, let's say, draft day in a redraft or draft day in a startup, now obviously being Dynasty, we do put a lot of weight in terms of a player's age, because ideally we want to build the youngest, most valuable roster we can, because then we can carry that through multiple seasons. And quarterback's a great position to, I guess, secure that asset, because if you know that you've got, say, a Justin Herbert, a Patrick Mahomes, a Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, that type of quarterback, you know that you've got that asset locked in. They've got guaranteed work. Kirk Cousins, on the other hand, outside of maybe a 2-quarterback league, you probably wouldn't sort of chase that asset. But what I want to highlight is that the fantasy output you're getting from that guy is actually really good. You can win most weeks. Their fantasy points this season anyway have not been that different. So to move this towards, say, a trade scenario, if you were a contending team and you were a quarterback away from, say, really giving a good push to challenging for that title, and say, for example, you had Tom Brady, who's just not getting anything done, or Aaron Rodgers at the moment. If you were to look at some quarterback options, yeah, you could go for one of these really top-end quarterbacks like a Justin Herbert. but you've got to be willing to pay for him. And you'd imagine that the person that has that player is going to charge a premium because of the name attached to him. When you consider that Kirk Cousins is putting up pretty much the same fantasy stats, he might be a much more economical option and getting a similar result in terms of what the goal of what you're trying to do, and that's win a title. So that's two really cool examples. Now I'm going to jump into running backs. As I mentioned earlier, I won't be doing historical data for the running backs. I did it for quarterbacks because I feel like they've got a few more stat areas that we can measure, which helps level out the result or takes a bit more into account. For running backs, they're pretty much measured on yards, receptions, and touchdowns, and their only negative seems to be fumbles. So we'll keep it nice and simple for the running backs. So running back 1, 7 games, 114 rush attempts, 561 yards, 5 touchdowns. Passing targets is 22, 17 receptions, 110 yards, no passing touchdowns. Total fantasy points on the season is 103.6 at an average of 14.8. So pretty active across the board. In both sort of, and in terms of receptions, catching pretty much the majority, I would say. Running back 2, 7 games, 102 rush attempts, 464 yards, 8 rushing touchdowns. Passing targets is 12, 9 receptions, 57 yards, 0 passing touchdowns. Total fantasy points is 102.6 at an average of 14.7. So very, very similar in terms of total fantasy points and average. The biggest difference I could see between the two is the total touchdowns. Now, if I was to tell you running back 1 was Dalvin Cook and running back 2 was Jamal Williams, ask yourself if you feel like, again, if you were given the option between the two, which one would you take? If a trade came across your table and it was, you wouldn't get Dalvin Cook for Jamal Williams, but if you were to try and trade a player for Jamal Williams, do you feel like you probably feel like you'd pay less for Williams than what you would for Cook? And I think 99.999% of fantasy owners would probably feel the same. What we've been able to highlight here is through the first 7 games, Jamal Williams is putting up almost exactly the same fantasy output as Dalvin Cook. So for what you could get Williams for, you're probably paying a lot more for Cook. So in the earlier scenario where I was talking about if you're only a quarterback away, well, if you're a running back 1 or 2, or even a flex, you just want to tidy up a flex position, an average of 14.7 or 14.8 points is massive out of that position. Again, stats courtesy of Fantasy Pros. So just consider that if it's a position you need, don't necessarily look at the top end. There's players that sort of sit in that sort of middle to lower tier that are delivering nearly the same fantasy points or fantasy output as some of your blue chip players. And that can be had for a lot less. And in terms of managing your roster and managing your value, I think that's a much more efficient way to do that and get almost similar, if not the same output. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I will highlight 1 wide receiver and 1 tight end just for reference and to run almost a case study within this case study of how a wide receiver might stack up against some running backs and I guess try and line up different names across different positions and whether or not, again, we have that same problem that we highlighted before with the running backs. So the wide receiver that I'm going to use for this example has played the same amount of games as the quarterbacks and running backs that I used earlier. So 7 games in total, 100.1 fantasy points total, an average of 14.3. Now their weekly breakdown is 25.1 in week 1, 8.2, 11.7, 15 flat, 25.9, 13.5, and 0.7. So what we see from that game log is massive ceilings compared to, I guess, a lot of players this season, and the floor is actually very low. So I guess it's very much rocks and diamonds with this player. Now, when I reveal the name, what I want you to do is not hear what I'm not saying. So when I reveal these players' names, particularly the big names, I'm not saying go and trade for these players, or this is an even trade. I'm not going down that road. And if you remember back to, I guess, my introductory episode, I'm not telling you guys who to go and trade for. I don't know how your leagues operate, and I don't know the dynamics you have within them. So it'd be really hard for me to say, yeah, these are trade targets. So this is purely just to highlight fantasy output versus how much weight we put on an actual player name. So the wide receiver that I've used in this example is Davante Adams. So we obviously know there's some issues in Las Vegas at the moment. I firmly believe, as I guess most of the fantasy community would, that this will sort itself out. He is a great wide receiver. He is definitely at the top of the tree for his position. So I'm not saying that you should go out and look to try and deal Davante Adams for Jamal Williams or vice versa. All I'm purely saying is Jamal Williams is averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game, and Davante Adams is averaging 14.3. When we look at fantasy output, they're almost identical. Well, Jamal Williams is actually averaging more. So in this scenario, the price you would have to pay, or what you would have to invest in Davante Adams, is obviously significantly more than what you would for Jamal, who's considered a backup running back, who you could get much later. For the exercise of, if you were trying to fill, and I would love to see a roster where Davante Adams is a flex, it would be stacked. But in this example, if you were trying to fill a flex position, you would be able to use Jamal Williams and get a better result for much cheaper than what you would for Davante Adams. So I found that quite interesting. Now for the tight end. Tight end was pretty tricky to do for this exercise, purely because the volatility of the position. We really didn't have anything stack up, either full season fantasy points or even average was tricky. So I'll reference the points exactly, but then I guess it's also important to highlight that if you're in a tight end premium league, your scoring might be a little different. So I guess take this with a grain of salt in that instance. But the tight end I've selected has played 8 games, so an extra game on top of everyone else that we've looked at. 100.5 total fantasy points and an average of 12.6. Their game log through those 8 games was 7.7, 21.2, 24.9, 2.5, 18.9, 20.1, 0.4, and 4.8. So similar to what we went through with Davante Adams. Massive ceilings and very, very low floors. So your average is probably, in one of these games, 0.4, there was 2 targets. So I'm not 100% sure whether they were injured in the game. I'm not a fan of this team, so I'm not too sure, but that seems very, very low. So that is obviously skewing the average. The tight end that I've referenced in this case is Mark Andrews. So he's within that top echelon. I mean, you'll have your argument as to whether Kelsey should be in his own tier, but he's definitely there with your Kittle. I want to say Pitts, but it's very hard. He's having a very bad season this year, as any owner of him would agree with. So if, again, it's really tricky to say, because tight end's its own position. So if you were needing a tight end and you were looking to move, I guess one of these players that is scoring, an average of 14 or 13, 14, 15 points per game, you can make a fair argument that the fantasy point output or the fantasy output does outweigh that. Where you might get a counter is because of position scarcity. Tight end is very tricky. When I looked at just purely to try and do this exercise, there are only 5 tight ends with double-digit fantasy points. So it's double-digit fantasy point average, which made it really, really tricky. And it just goes back to how hard it is to get tight end right. And if you've got a good one, you really need to keep them. But in the interests of this exercise, you'd say that as good as Mark Andrews is, unless you had to play him, if you're playing him as your main tight end, great, you just leave him there. But if you're looking for a fill-in at a flex spot or something, I guess, to put you over the top, you could probably look elsewhere to get a better result than, I guess, what we consider as a top tier tight end. But and as I said, unless you're in a tight end premium league, you're probably looking elsewhere anyway, I would guess. So look, that we might wrap it up there. This was really fun. I hope everyone got something out of this. For me, I've always been big on, whenever a trade comes across to me, don't necessarily look at the names attached to it. Dig a little deeper and see what it's actually going to do for your team, where the points are going to come from, because at the end of the day, it's fantasy points that matter. You don't get bonus points for having a blue chip player or a top 5 at their position player. If they're not delivering you fantasy points, then there is no point having them. There's no point doing it. So just bear that in mind. And I guess, as I always say, you are the best judge of your own roster, where you're at and what you need to put yourself over the top. Thanks for checking it out, and I'll see you next week.